The autumn wind of 1884 carried the scent of dying grass across the endless plains of Nebraska Territory, where Sam McAllister rode his weary horse through what had once been the thriving cattle town of Cedar Ridge. The streets that had bustled with activity just 2 years earlier now lay eerily silent, broken only by the creaking of loose shutters and the mournful whistle of wind through abandoned buildings. Sam pulled his worn coat tighter against the chill, his weathered hands gripping the reins of Belle, a mare that had been his faithful companion for nearly a decade of wandering across the American frontier. At 45 years old, Sam McAllister had lived the kind of hard life that carved deep lines into a man's face and left permanent shadows behind his eyes. His tall, lean frame bore the marks of countless days in the saddle, countless nights sleeping under stars that offered no comfort, and countless meals missed in favor of ensuring his horse had enough to eat. The gray that streaked his brown hair and beard spoke not just of age, but of experiences that had tested every fiber of his being. Yet despite the hardships that had shaped him, there remained in Sam's blue eyes a fundamental kindness that no amount of suffering had been able to extinguish. Sam had been a cowboy for most of his adult life, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, from Colorado to Montana, following the seasonal rhythms of an industry that had made fortunes for some and left others with nothing but calloused hands and empty pockets. He had never married, never owned land, never accumulated the kind of wealth that would allow him to settle down in comfort. Instead, he had chosen the lonely path of the drifter, moving from ranch to ranch as work demanded, forming temporary friendships that inevitably ended when the job was done and it was time to move on. The town of Cedar Ridge had been Sam's home for the better part of 2 years, the longest he had stayed anywhere since leaving his family's farm in Missouri 25 years earlier. He had found work with the Double Bar Ranch, owned by a fair-minded man named Thomas Brennan, who treated his cowboys with respect and paid them honestly for their labor. It had been good work, honest work, the kind that allowed a man to take pride in what he did, even if it would never make him rich. Sam had even begun to think about the possibility of saving enough money to buy a small piece of land, maybe raise a few head of cattle of his own. But the harsh winter of 1883 had changed everything. A series of blizzards unlike anything the old-timers could remember had swept across the plains, killing cattle by the thousands and bankrupting ranchers who had built their fortunes on the assumption that such disasters were impossible. The Double Bar Ranch had lost 90% of its herd, and Thomas Brennan, rather than abandon his cowboys to fend for themselves, had sold everything he owned to pay them what he owed, before quietly putting a bullet in his head behind the barn where he had once kept his prize-breeding bulls. The economic devastation that followed the winter had transformed Cedar Ridge from a prosperous cattle town into a ghost town almost overnight. Businesses closed, families packed up and moved away, and the few people who remained struggled to survive on whatever scraps they could find. The railroad that had brought prosperity to the town diverted its routes to more profitable destinations, leaving Cedar Ridge isolated and forgotten in the vast emptiness of the Nebraska plains. Sam had stayed longer than most, partly because he had nowhere else to go, and partly because he felt a responsibility to help the families who couldn't afford to leave. He had used the last of his savings to buy food for the widow Patterson and her 3 young children, had given his winter coat to old Jake Morrison, who was too proud to ask for help, but too poor to buy warm clothes, and had spent countless hours repairing roofs and chopping firewood for people who could no longer afford to hire such work done. Now, as October gave way to November, Sam found himself down to his last few dollars and the last of the dried beef that had been his primary sustenance for the past month. His stomach had been growling for days, and he knew that Belle was as hungry as he was, her ribs beginning to show through her winter coat, despite his best efforts to find her decent grazing. The time had come to face the reality that he could no longer help anyone because he could barely help himself. As Sam rode slowly down what had once been Cedar Ridge's main street, he noticed a small figure huddled in the doorway of the abandoned mercantile. At first glance, it appeared to be a bundle of rags left behind by some departed family, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. The child was painfully thin, his clothes little more than tatters, and he was shivering violently in the cold autumn air. Sam dismounted and approached the boy carefully, not wanting to frighten him. As he drew closer, he could see that the child was Mexican, probably the son of one of the families that had come north looking for work during the cattle boom years. His dark eyes were wide with hunger and fear, and Sam could see that he had been crying, though he was trying hard to be brave. "Hey there, son," Sam said gently, crouching down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" The child looked up at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. "Miguel," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Well, Miguel, what are you doing out here all by yourself? Where's your family?" The boy's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away with the back of his hand. "Mama got sick," he said in heavily accented English. "Papa took her to find doctor in next town. Said they'd come back soon, but that was many days ago." Sam felt his heart sink as he realized what had happened. The boy's parents had probably intended to return, but something had gone wrong. Maybe they had run out of money for medical care. Maybe his mother had died and his father couldn't bear to come back. Or maybe they had simply gotten lost in the vastness of the Nebraska plains. Whatever the reason, Miguel had been abandoned, left to fend for himself in a dying town where even the adults could barely survive. "When did you last eat, son?" Sam asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Miguel looked down at his hands. "I found some potatoes yesterday," he said, "but they were, how you say, bad. Made me sick." Sam reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the last of his dried beef, a piece no bigger than his palm, that he had been saving for his own dinner. He looked at it for a moment, knowing that once he gave it away, he would have nothing left to eat until he could find work, or somehow earn money for food. His stomach cramped with hunger at the thought, but when he looked at Miguel's gaunt face, the decision made itself. "Here," Sam said, handing the boy the meat. "This should help." Miguel's eyes widened as he stared at the food. "For me?" he asked, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "For you," Sam confirmed. "Go ahead. Eat it." The boy took the meat with trembling hands and began to eat it slowly, savoring each bite as if it were the finest steak he had ever tasted. Sam watched him eat and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold wind that was beginning to pick up. It was the warmth that came from doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything you had. "Thank you, Senor," Miguel said when he had finished eating. "You are very kind." Sam ruffled the boy's hair gently. "What are you going to do now, Miguel? You can't stay here by yourself." The boy shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. "I wait for Mama and Papa," he said. "They will come back." Sam knew that Miguel's parents were never coming back, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy the boy's hope. Instead, he made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences he could never have imagined. "Tell you what," Sam said. "I'm going to ride into the next town and see if I can find some work. When I come back, I'll bring food and we'll figure out what to do about finding your parents. Can you wait here for me?" Miguel nodded eagerly. "Si, senor. I wait here." Sam climbed back onto Bell and rode out of Cedar Ridge with a heavy heart, knowing that he had just promised something he might not be able to deliver. He had no money, no prospects for immediate work, and winter was coming fast. But he also knew that he couldn't abandon the boy any more than he could have kept that piece of meat for himself while watching Miguel starve. The nearest town was Millerville, about 20 miles east of Cedar Ridge. It was smaller than Cedar Ridge had been in its heyday, but it was still alive, still functioning, still a place where a man might find work if he was willing to do anything and ask for very little in return. Sam had been there once before, shortly after arriving in the area, and remembered it as a hard place full of hard people who had little patience for charity or sentiment. The ride to Millerville took most of the day, and by the time Sam arrived, the sun was setting and his stomach was cramping with hunger. He had given his last food to Miguel, and now he was beginning to feel the full impact of that decision. His hands shook slightly as he guided Bell down the main street, looking for any sign of opportunity, any chance to earn enough money to buy food and return to the boy who was counting on him. The first place he tried was the saloon, hoping that the owner might need someone to clean up or tend bar in exchange for a meal. But the bartender, A surly man with suspicious eyes took one look at Sam's worn clothes and hollow cheeks and shook his head before Sam could even finish explaining what he needed. "We don't hire drifters," the man said bluntly, "and we don't give handouts. Move along." Sam tried the general store next, then the blacksmith, then the hotel, but the response was the same everywhere he went. Times were hard for everyone, and nobody wanted to take a chance on a stranger who looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Some people were polite about turning him away, others were rude, but the result was always the same. By the time full darkness had fallen, Sam found himself sitting on a bench outside the train station, wondering how he was going to keep his promise to Miguel. It was there that he overheard a conversation that would change everything. 3 men were standing near the station platform, talking in low voices about something that had clearly upset them. Sam wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried in the still night air, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "So I'm telling you it ain't right," one of the men was saying. "That boy's been asking for help all day and nobody's lifted a finger." "What boy?" asked another voice. "Mexican kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Says his parents left him in Cedar Ridge and never came back. He's been going door to door here in town begging for food, but folks just slammed the door in his face." Sam's heart began to race as he realized they were talking about Miguel. Somehow the boy had made it to Millerville, probably walking the entire 20 miles on foot. The thought of that small, hungry child walking alone across the dangerous plains filled Sam with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Where is he now?" the first man asked. "Last I saw, he was curled up behind Morrison's barn, shivering like a leaf. Poor little thing's going to freeze to death if this cold keeps up." Sam didn't wait to hear any more. He jumped up from the bench and headed toward the area where Morrison's barn was located, his heart pounding with worry and determination. If Miguel had somehow made it to Millerville on his own, then Sam was going to find him and figure out a way to help him, even if it meant begging every person in town until someone showed mercy. He found Miguel exactly where the men had said he would be, huddled behind the barn in a pathetic attempt to escape the wind. The boy was unconscious, his small body racked with shivering, and Sam could see that his lips were blue with cold. Without hesitation, Sam scooped the child up in his arms and carried him to the front of the barn, where a lantern provided both light and a small amount of warmth. "Miguel," Sam said urgently, gently shaking the boy's shoulders. "Miguel, wake up." The child's eyes fluttered open, and when he saw Sam's face, he managed a weak smile. "Senor Sam," he whispered, "you came back." "Of course I came back," Sam said, pulling off his own jacket and wrapping it around the boy. "I promised, didn't I?" As Sam held Miguel close, trying to share what little body heat he had, he became aware that they were no longer alone. A small crowd had gathered around them, drawn by the sight of a grown man cradling a child in the cold night air. Sam looked up to see perhaps a dozen people watching them, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. "This the Mexican boy been asking for help?" asked a woman Sam didn't recognize. "Yes," Sam said simply. "His name is Miguel. His parents left him in Cedar Ridge and never came back. He's hungry and cold and scared, and he needs help." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Sam could see the conflict in their faces, the battle between natural human compassion and the harsh realities of frontier life that taught people to protect their own first and worry about strangers later. Finally, an older man stepped forward. Sam recognized him as Morrison, the owner of the barn. "Bring him inside," Morrison said gruffly. "We can at least get him warm." The barn was filled with the sweet smell of hay and the comforting warmth of the animals Morrison kept there. Sam laid Miguel down on a pile of clean straw and covered him with every blanket Morrison could find. The boy was still shivering, but some color was beginning to return to his cheeks. "He needs food," Sam said, looking around at the people who had followed them into the barn. "And medical attention. I don't have any money, but I'll work for anyone who can help him. I'll do anything." The crowd murmured among themselves, but nobody stepped forward with an offer of help. Sam could see the reluctance in their faces, the fear of getting involved in something that might cost them more than they could afford. These were hard-working people who had their own families to worry about, their own struggles to overcome. It was then that something unexpected happened. A young cowboy who had been standing at the back of the group pushed his way forward. Sam had noticed him earlier because of his distinctive appearance. He was probably no more than 25, with bright red hair and freckles that made him look even younger, but there was something in his green eyes that suggested he had seen more of life than his years would indicate. "I'll help," the young man said simply. "Name's Patrick O'Malley. I work for the Circle K Ranch about 10 miles south of here. I don't have much money, but I can spare a few dollars for food and medicine." His offer seemed to break a dam of reluctance in the crowd. One by one, other people began to step forward with offers of help. A woman named Mrs. Jenkins offered to take Miguel to her home and care for him until he was stronger. The local doctor, a man named Patterson, agreed to examine the boy without charge. Even Morrison, despite his gruff exterior, offered to let them stay in his barn as long as necessary. But it was Patrick O'Malley who impressed Sam the most. The young cowboy not only contributed money for immediate necessities, but he also spent the rest of the night helping Sam care for Miguel, sharing his own food and staying awake to make sure the boy's condition didn't worsen. By morning, it was clear that Miguel was going to recover, but it was also clear that the experience had forged an unexpected bond between Sam and Patrick. "Why did you help?" Sam asked Patrick as they sat drinking coffee outside the barn, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Patrick was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if looking for the right words. "I was that kid once," he finally said. "Different circumstances, but same basic situation. Irish immigrant family. Parents died of fever when I was about Miguel's age. I ended up on the streets of Chicago, begging for scraps, sleeping in doorways. If it hadn't been for the kindness of strangers, I would have died." He took a sip of his coffee and continued. "Eventually, a family took me in, gave me a chance to make something of myself. I worked my way west, learned to be a cowboy, found a place where I belonged. But I never forgot what it felt like to be helpless and alone, and I swore that if I ever had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would take it." Sam nodded, understanding the motivation that had driven Patrick's generosity. "What's going to happen to Miguel now?" "Mrs. Jenkins seems like a good woman," Patrick said. "She lost her own son to pneumonia last winter, and I think caring for Miguel might help her as much as it helps him. As for the long term, well, we'll figure that out as we go." Over the next few weeks, Sam found himself staying in Millerville longer than he had planned. Mrs. Jenkins had indeed taken Miguel into her home, and the boy was recovering quickly under her care. But Sam felt a responsibility to make sure the arrangement worked out, and he also found himself drawn to the friendship he had developed with Patrick O'Malley. Patrick was unlike any cowboy Sam had ever met. He was educated, well-read, and thoughtful in a way that was rare on the frontier. He spoke fluent Spanish, which allowed him to communicate with Miguel in his native language, and he had a natural way with horses that bordered on magical. Most importantly, he seemed to understand the loneliness that had driven Sam to make the sacrifice that had started this whole chain of events. "You know," Patrick said one evening as they sat on Mrs. Jenkins's front porch watching Miguel play with the other children in the neighborhood, "what you did back there in Cedar Ridge, giving that boy your last food, that took real courage." Sam shook his head. "Wasn't courage," he said. "Was just the right thing to do." "Same thing in my book," Patrick replied. "But I've been thinking about something. You've been drifting from place to place for years, never settling down, never building anything permanent. What if there was a way to change that?" Sam looked at his young friend with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Patrick leaned forward, his eyes bright with an idea that had clearly been developing for some time. "The Circle K Ranch where I work, the owner is getting old, and he's been talking about needing a foreman, someone he can trust to help him run the operation. The pay is good, the work is steady, and it would give you a chance to put down roots, maybe even save enough money to buy your own spread someday." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Sam wanted to admit. After years of wandering, the idea of having a permanent home, a steady job, and the respect that came with being a foreman was almost too good to be true. But Sam had learned to be suspicious of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "Why would your boss hire me?" Sam asked. "He doesn't even know me." Patrick grinned. "Actually, he does know you. Mr. Kennedy was one of the people in that crowd the night we found Miguel. He saw how you took care of that boy, how you were willing to sacrifice everything for a stranger. He said any man with that kind of character was exactly the kind of person he wanted working for him. The conversation was interrupted by Miguel, who came running up to the porch with the excitement that only children could maintain. His English had improved dramatically in the few weeks he had been with Mrs. Jenkins, and his health had returned along with his spirits. "Senor Sam, Senor Patrick," Miguel called out. "Mrs. Jenkins says you come for dinner. She makes very good food." As they followed Miguel into the house, Sam found himself thinking about Patrick's offer and about the strange turns his life had taken since that day in Cedar Ridge, when he had given his last piece of meat to a hungry child. He had expected that act of generosity to cost him everything, but instead, it seemed to have opened doors he never could have imagined. Dinner at Mrs. Jenkins' house was a warm, family affair that reminded Sam of everything he had been missing during his years of solitary wandering. Mrs. Jenkins was a natural mother, and she had embraced Miguel as if he were her own son. The boy, for his part, had blossomed under her care, his natural cheerfulness returning as he recovered from the trauma of abandonment and hunger. "Miguel has been asking about going to school," Mrs. Jenkins said, as they sat around her kitchen table, sharing a meal of pot roast and vegetables from her garden. "I think it would be good for him, help him learn to read and write English properly." "That's a wonderful idea," Sam said, looking at Miguel with pride. "Education is the key to making something of yourself in this country." Miguel beamed at the praise. "I want to learn everything," he said with the enthusiasm that only children possessed. "Mrs. Jenkins teaches me words, and Senor Patrick teaches me about horses. Maybe someday I be Cowboy too." Patrick laughed. "Maybe you will, Miguel. But first, you need to get big and strong and learn as much as you can." As the evening progressed, Sam found himself watching the interactions between Miguel, Mrs. Jenkins, and Patrick, and he realized that something remarkable had happened. A random act of kindness had created a new family, bound together not by blood, but by shared experiences and mutual care. Miguel had found a home with Mrs. Jenkins, Patrick had found purpose in helping others, and Sam had found something he hadn't even realized he was looking for, a sense of belonging. The next morning, Sam made his decision about Patrick's job offer. He would accept the position at the Circle K Ranch, not just because it was a good opportunity, but because it would allow him to stay close to the people who had become important to him. For the first time in his adult life, he had found a place where his presence mattered, where his actions had consequences beyond his own survival. The Circle K Ranch turned out to be everything Patrick had promised, and more. Robert Kennedy was a fair and honest man who had built his operation on principles of hard work and mutual respect. He welcomed Sam as his foreman with genuine warmth, and it quickly became clear that Patrick had not exaggerated when he described Sam's reputation in the community. "Word gets around fast in country like this," Kennedy explained as he showed Sam around the ranch. "People have been talking about what you did for that Mexican boy, how you gave him your last food when you were hungry yourself. That kind of character is rare, and it's exactly what I need in a foreman." The work was challenging but satisfying, involving everything from managing the day-to-day operations of the ranch to planning for the future expansion of the herd. Sam found that his years of experience working for different operations had given him a breadth of knowledge that served him well in his new role. More importantly, he discovered that he had a natural talent for leadership, an ability to inspire loyalty and hard work in the men under his supervision. Winter came early that year, bringing with it the kind of harsh weather that tested everyone's resolve. But the Circle K Ranch was well prepared, with adequate shelter for the animals and sufficient feed to last until spring. Sam took particular pride in the fact that none of the cattle were lost to the cold, a stark contrast to the devastating losses that had destroyed so many ranches the previous year. It was during one of the worst blizzards of the winter that Sam received unexpected visitors. He was checking on the cattle in the main barn when he heard the sound of horses approaching through the storm. When he opened the barn door, he was amazed to see a group of about 20 cowboys riding toward the ranch buildings, their faces almost invisible behind scarves and hat brims pulled low against the wind. The leader of the group was a man Sam recognized immediately, Jake Morrison, an old-timer who had worked cattle drives all over the West and was respected throughout the territory for his experience and integrity. Behind him rode men from ranches across Nebraska and Colorado, all of them battling the storm to reach the Circle K ranch. "Jake," Sam called out, hurrying to help the men get their horses into shelter. "What brings you out in weather like this?" Jake's weathered face broke into a grin as he dismounted and shook the snow from his coat. "We came to see you, Sam McAllister. We've got a proposition to make." As the Cowboys crowded into the warm barn, shaking off the cold and greeting Sam with the easy familiarity of men who shared a dangerous profession, Sam realized that something significant was happening. These weren't just neighbors paying a social call. This was a gathering with a purpose. "You remember last fall when you helped that Mexican boy in Millerville?" Jake asked, getting straight to the point. "Of course," Sam replied. "Miguel. He's doing well, by the way, living with Mrs. Jenkins, going to school." "That's good to hear," Jake said. "But that's not why we're here. See, word of what you did spread a lot further than you might think. Cowboys talk, Sam, and when they hear about someone doing something truly decent, they remember it." Another cowboy, a man named Red Sullivan, whom Sam had worked with years earlier on a drive to Kansas, stepped forward. "We've been talking among ourselves, Sam, about the problems we've all been having. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, crooked politicians who favor the big railroad companies over honest ranchers. It's getting so a man can't make an honest living anymore." Sam nodded, understanding the frustration that motivated their words. The frontier was changing rapidly, and not always for the better. The days when a man's word was his bond and disputes were settled face to face were giving way to a more complex world where money and political connections often mattered more than character and hard work. "What we need," Jake continued, "is someone to organize us, someone who can bring the small ranchers and independent cowboys together so we can protect our interests, someone with the respect and trust of men from all over the territory." Sam began to understand where the conversation was heading, and the realization both excited and intimidated him. "And you think I'm that someone?" "We know you are," Red said firmly. "What you did for that boy, giving your last food to a stranger's child when you were hungry yourself, that showed us what kind of man you are. A man who will sacrifice for others, who will do the right thing even when it costs him everything." The conversation continued for hours, with the Cowboys sharing stories of injustices they had witnessed and problems they had encountered. Cattle thieves were operating with impunity, protected by corrupt sheriffs who were more interested in bribes than justice. Railroad companies were using their political influence to drive small ranchers off valuable land. Foreign investors were buying up huge tracts of rangeland and fencing it off, denying access to water sources that had been used by local ranchers for generations. "What we're proposing," Jake explained, "is the formation of a cattlemen's association, with you as the president. We'd pool our resources, share information about rustlers and other criminals, and work together to make sure honest ranchers get fair treatment from the law and the politicians." The idea was ambitious, perhaps even revolutionary for its time. In an era when individualism was prized above all else, the concept of organized cooperation among independent ranchers was both innovative and potentially powerful. But Sam also understood the risks involved. Such an organization would inevitably make enemies among those who profited from the current system of corruption and exploitation. "This is a big decision," Sam said finally. "I need time to think about it." "Of course," Jake replied, "but don't think too long. Things are getting worse out there and we need to act soon if we're going to make a difference." After the Cowboys left, battling their way back through the blizzard to their respective ranches, Sam found himself alone with his thoughts and the weight of an important decision. He walked through the storm to the main house, where Kennedy was waiting with hot coffee and a warm fire. "Heard you had some visitors," Kennedy said as Sam settled into a chair by the fireplace. Sam explained the conversation he had just had, and Kennedy listened with the thoughtful attention of a man who understood the complexities of the situation. When Sam finished, Kennedy was quiet for several minutes, staring into the flames as if looking for wisdom in their dancing light. "It's a good idea," Kennedy said finally. "Long overdue, actually, but it won't be easy. You'll be making enemies of some very powerful people." "I know," Sam replied, "but I keep thinking about something Patrick said about how my sacrifice for Miguel took courage. Maybe this is another one of those situations where doing the right thing requires taking risks." Kennedy nodded slowly. That boy changed your life, didn't he? That act of giving him your last food set off a chain of events that led to all of this. Sam smiled, thinking about Miguel's bright face and the progress he had made in school. Sometimes I think he saved me more than I saved him. Over the next few weeks, as winter gradually gave way to spring, Sam found himself thinking constantly about the proposal the Cowboys had made. He talked to Patrick about it, to Mrs. Jenkins, even to Miguel, whose childish but sincere perspective often cut through adult complications to reach the heart of an issue. "You should help them, Senor Sam," Miguel said during one of their regular visits. "Like you helped me. When good people work together, they can do things that seem impossible." The wisdom of the observation struck Sam with surprising force. Miguel was right. The act of helping him had brought together people who might never have met otherwise, creating relationships and opportunities that had benefited everyone involved. Perhaps the same principle could work on a larger scale. Sam's decision was made for him by an event that occurred in early April. A small rancher named Pete Williams, whom Sam had known for several years, came to the Circle K ranch with a story that made Sam's blood boil with anger. Williams' cattle had been rustled by a gang of thieves who were operating under the protection of a corrupt sheriff in a neighboring county. When Williams had tried to recover his livestock, he had been threatened with arrest for disturbing the peace. "They took everything, Sam," Williams said, his voice breaking with emotion. 20 years of work gone, and there's nothing I can do about it, because the law is on their side." That night, Sam sat down and wrote letters to Jake Morrison and the other cowboys who had visited him during the blizzard. His message was simple. He would accept their offer to lead the Cattlemen's Association, and their first order of business would be to help Pete Williams recover his stolen cattle and see that justice was done. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, nearly 200 cowboys from across Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas had converged on the Circle K ranch, ready to take action against the rustlers and their corrupt protectors. The sight of so many men united in a common cause was both inspiring and sobering, a demonstration of the power that could be wielded when good people decided to stand together against injustice. The campaign to recover Williams' cattle and bring the rustlers to justice became the first major action of the newly formed Cattlemen's Association. It was carefully planned and executed with military precision, involving coordinated raids on several rustler hideouts and the presentation of irrefutable evidence to federal authorities who were not corrupted by local political influences. The success of the operation exceeded everyone's expectations. Not only were Williams' cattle recovered, but the entire rustling operation was dismantled, and several corrupt officials were removed from office and prosecuted for their crimes. More importantly, word of the Cattlemen's Association's effectiveness spread throughout the region, encouraging other victims of injustice to come forward and deterring potential criminals who had previously operated with impunity. Over the months that followed, the association grew into a powerful force for positive change throughout the American West. Under Sam's leadership, it developed into much more than just a group of vigilantes. It became a sophisticated organization that worked within the legal system to ensure fair treatment for honest ranchers and to promote the development of sustainable agricultural practices. The association established its own network of investigators to track down cattle thieves and gather evidence for prosecution. It created a system of mutual aid that allowed small ranchers to pool their resources during difficult times. It lobbied for legislation that protected the rights of independent ranchers against the encroachment of large corporate interests. Most importantly, it maintained the principles of integrity and fairness that had motivated its founding. Sam's reputation as a leader grew along with the association's success, but he never forgot the lesson that Miguel had taught him about the power of simple human kindness. He insisted that the association help not just its members, but anyone who was being treated unfairly, regardless of their race, nationality, or economic status. This policy sometimes created controversy, but it also earned the organization respect from unexpected quarters. One of Sam's proudest moments came when Miguel, now a teenager and an excellent student, was accepted to attend college in Denver on a scholarship that the association had helped establish for the children of ranch families. The boy who had once been starving and abandoned in Cedar Ridge was going to become a teacher, carrying forward the values of education and service that Mrs. Jenkins and Sam had instilled in him. "You know, Senor Sam," Miguel said on the day before he left for college, "I have been thinking about that day when you gave me your last piece of meat. I was so hungry and scared, I thought I was going to die. But you saved me, not just with the food, but with the kindness. You showed me that there are good people in the world, people who will help strangers, even when it costs them everything." Sam felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to the young man who had become like a son to him. "You saved me too, Miguel. You reminded me that my life could have purpose beyond just my own survival." "But here is what I have been thinking," Miguel continued. "That piece of meat, it was not just food, it was like a seed planted in hungry ground. And look what grew from it, Mrs. Jenkins found a new family. Senor Patrick found his calling. You found your purpose, and 200 cowboys found the courage to stand up for justice. One small act of kindness created all of this." The truth of Miguel's observation struck Sam with profound force. He had given away his last piece of meat expecting that it would cost him everything, but instead, it had given him everything that truly mattered. The chain of events that followed had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others throughout the American West. As Sam reflected on the journey that had brought him from a lonely, drifting cowboy to the respected leader of a powerful organization dedicated to justice and fairness, he realized that Miguel had taught him the most important lesson of all, that true wealth was not measured in dollars or acres, but in the connections you made with other people and the positive impact you had on their lives. Years passed, and the Cattlemen's Association continued to grow and evolve under Sam's leadership. The organization became a model for similar groups throughout the American West, proving that ordinary people could work together to create extraordinary change. Sam never married, but he found family in the extended network of ranchers, cowboys, and their children who looked to him for guidance and support. Patrick O'Malley became Sam's right-hand man and eventual successor as president of the association. He had learned well from Sam's example, combining his natural intelligence with the wisdom that came from understanding that true leadership meant serving others rather than being served by them. Together, they built an organization that outlasted both of them, continuing to protect the interests of honest ranchers well into the 20th century. Mrs. Jenkins remained a central figure in Sam's life until her death at the age of 78. She had taken in 3 more orphaned children over the years, creating a home where love was more important than blood relations. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, including many successful adults who had started life as abandoned or neglected children under her care. Miguel returned from college as Dr. Miguel Sanchez, becoming the first Mexican-American professor at the University of Colorado. He never forgot the lessons he had learned from Sam about the importance of helping others, and he dedicated his career to improving educational opportunities for children from poor and immigrant families. He married a fellow teacher and raised 4 children of his own, passing down the stories of Sam's kindness and the values it represented. But perhaps the most significant legacy of that day, when Sam gave his last piece of meat to a hungry child, was the way it changed how people throughout the region thought about their responsibilities to one another. The story was told and retold, becoming part of the folklore of the American West, but it was more than just a tale of individual heroism. It became a symbol of the idea that true strength came not from taking care of yourself alone, but from being willing to sacrifice for the welfare of others. The principle that Sam had demonstrated, that a person's character was measured not by what they accumulated, but by what they were willing to give away, became central to the culture of the ranching communities throughout Nebraska, Colorado, and Kansas. Children grew up hearing the story of Sam McAllister and Miguel, learning that kindness was not weakness, but the foundation of real community. As Sam aged, he often found himself thinking about the moment when he had reached into his saddlebag and pulled out that piece of dried beef, knowing it was all the food he had left in the world. At the time, it had seemed like such a small thing, hardly worth mentioning. But that small act had created ripples that spread far beyond anything he could have imagined, touching thousands of lives and creating institutions that would last for generations. He came to understand that this was how real change happened in the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but through individual acts of decency that inspired others to be decent in return. One person's willingness to sacrifice for a stranger could create a chain reaction of goodness that had no end. In his final years, Sam often sat on the porch of the small house he had built near the Circle K ranch, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of gold and crimson. Visitors would come to seek his advice on various matters, and young cowboys would stop by to hear stories of the early days of the Cattlemen's Association. But his favorite visitors were always the children and grandchildren of the people whose lives had been touched by that act of kindness so many years before. They came not just because he was a respected elder, but because he represented something important about the character they wanted to develop in themselves. Sam had shown that it was possible to live a life guided by principles rather than profit, to build wealth that was measured in relationships rather than possessions, and to leave a legacy that would outlast any material inheritance. When Sam McAllister died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, his funeral became one of the largest gatherings in the history of the territory. Cowboys came from all over the West to pay their respects, but they were joined by farmers, merchants, teachers, politicians, and hundreds of ordinary people whose lives had been improved by the work of the Cattlemen's Association. Dr. Miguel Sanchez delivered the eulogy, speaking in both English and Spanish to honor the diverse community that Sam had helped create. He told the familiar story of how Sam had given his last piece of meat to a hungry child, but he ended with a challenge to everyone present. Sam McAllister showed us that heroism is not about being stronger or braver than other people, Miguel said. It is about choosing to care for others even when it costs us something we think we cannot afford to lose. Each of us will face moments when we have the opportunity to help someone in need, to choose generosity over selfishness, to plant seeds of kindness that might grow into something beautiful. The question is not whether we will have these opportunities. The question is whether we will have the courage to take them. The cemetery where Sam was buried became a place of pilgrimage for people who had been inspired by his story. But the real monument to his life was not made of stone or bronze. It was the living network of relationships and institutions that continued to embody the principles he had lived by. The Cattlemen's Association evolved over the decades, eventually becoming a broader organization focused on rural development and agricultural education, but it never abandoned its founding commitment to fairness and mutual aid. Decades after Sam's death, children throughout the American West still grew up hearing the story of the lonely cowboy who gave his last piece of meat to a hungry child and discovered that generosity was the most powerful force in the world. The story became a parable about the importance of looking beyond your own immediate needs to see the needs of others, about the way small acts of kindness could create large changes in the world, and about the truth that what you gave away was often what you got back multiplied many times over. But perhaps the most important lesson of Sam McAllister's life was that heroism was not something reserved for special people in extraordinary circumstances. It was something available to anyone who was willing to choose compassion over comfort, service over selfishness, and hope over despair. The piece of meat that Sam gave to Miguel was not special food. It was ordinary dried beef, tough and salty and barely palatable. What made it special was the love with which it was given, and the faith that doing the right thing would somehow lead to right results. That faith had been justified in ways that Sam could never have anticipated when he made that simple choice in the abandoned streets of Cedar Ridge. One act of selfless kindness had created a movement that transformed an entire region, touching thousands of lives and establishing principles of justice and cooperation that lasted for generations. It proved that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were guided by extraordinary values. The story of Sam McAllister and Miguel became more than just a tale of individual heroism. It became a testament to the power of human decency to overcome the forces of selfishness and exploitation that threatened to dominate frontier society. It showed that even in the harsh world of the American West, where survival often depended on looking out for yourself first, there was still room for the kind of generosity that put the welfare of others ahead of personal comfort. Most importantly, it demonstrated that true leadership was not about commanding others, but about inspiring them to be their best selves. Sam had never sought power or recognition, but by consistently choosing to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost, he had earned the respect and loyalty of people throughout the region. His willingness to sacrifice for a stranger's child had shown others that they too could be better than they thought possible. Today, more than a century after that cold autumn day when Sam McAllister gave his last piece of meat to a hungry child named Miguel, their story continues to inspire people who face their own moments of choice between selfishness and sacrifice. In a world that often seems dominated by greed and indifference, the example of Sam's generosity reminds us that individual acts of kindness still have the power to change lives and transform communities. The lesson of Sam's life is ultimately about the mathematics of generosity, the mysterious way that giving away what you think you cannot afford to lose often results in gaining more than you ever dreamed possible. When Sam handed that piece of dried beef to Miguel, he thought he was giving away his last meal. Instead, he was giving away his loneliness, his purposelessness, and his isolation from the human community. In return, he received friendship, respect, purpose, and a legacy that outlasted his own lifetime. He discovered that the secret to a meaningful life was not in accumulating possessions or achieving personal success, but in being willing to sacrifice for others and trust that such sacrifices would somehow create more good in the world than they cost. The story teaches us that we never know when our own moment of choice will come, when we will encounter someone who needs our help, and we will have to decide between protecting our own interests and extending ourselves for a stranger. But it also teaches us that these moments of choice are not burdens to be endured, but opportunities to discover the best parts of ourselves and to participate in the ongoing work of making the world a more compassionate place. Sam McAllister's legacy lives on not just in the institutions he helped create or the lives he directly touched, but in the principle he embodied, that no act of genuine kindness is ever wasted, that generosity is its own reward, and that the willingness to sacrifice for others is the foundation of everything that makes life worth living. His story reminds us that heroism is not about having special powers or abilities, but about having the courage to act on our deepest values when it matters most. In the end, the piece of meat that Sam gave to Miguel was not just food. It was hope, dignity, and proof that even in the darkest circumstances, there were still people willing to care for strangers. That gift multiplied beyond all calculation, creating a legacy of kindness that continues to inspire people to choose generosity over selfishness, compassion over indifference, and love over fear. The lonely cowboy who thought he was giving away his last meal had actually given away the first installment in a fortune of human connection and meaningful purpose that would enrich his life and the lives of countless others for generations to come. It was a transaction that proved the greatest truth of all, that in giving we receive, in helping others we help ourselves, and in choosing love over fear, we discover that love is indeed the most powerful force in the universe.